The Turkish revolutionaries found themselves at odds not only with their Greek neighbors but also with their own countrymen in Istanbul. They were tasked with fighting a war and a rebellion all at once, but victory would mean ultimate freedom. Looking to save their sinking ship, the Ottoman government in Istanbul turned to a Circassian hero. This man was named Ahmet Anzavur, a staunch foe of Mustafa Kemal and the rebellion. According to Anzavur, Kemal's men were wicked Unionists and Freemasons who had to be put down. He thus joined the Sultan in the fight against the Nationalists, with the British initially right alongside them. However, the dynamic shifted when the British began to understand the effort it would truly take to quell the growing revolution. War-weary and hesitant to upset their population back home, the Entente leaders began to look to their Greek friends to tap in. By now, it was clear that Turkey was home to two unmoving government authorities, one in Istanbul and the other, the Nationalists in Ankara. Left to their own devices, the Western powers believed the rebels would overthrow the Ottoman government in a matter of time. This was problematic, as a huge part of why the war broke out rested on the Nationalists' intolerance of Entente supervision. The Sultan and his officials could be managed, but Kemal and his men could not. Thus, nations like Britain had a motive to assist the Istanbul government, even if that had to be done through the Greeks. By the summer of 1919, Greek troops had already landed in Smyrna, and clashes with local Turks had erupted. At the time, the Greeks had been moving to expand their zone of occupation in the face of violent nationalist resistance. As the season turned to fall in 1920, they pushed more easterly into Anatolia, aiming to pressure the Turks into signing the thus far failed Treaty of Sèvres, which would begin partitioning the Ottoman Empire. This agreement had only further inflamed the nationalists, who still saw themselves in a position worth fighting for. The aims of both sides collided on January 9, 1921, when the outbreak of the First Battle of Annona saw the Turks manage to halt the Greek advance, forcing their opponent to turn back 2 days after the battle had begun. It's believed that the success of İsmet's men at this clash is directly responsible for the Turkish constitution of 1921 being ratified less than 2 weeks later. Over the following months, the Conference of London hosted the Entente, allowing the Allies to discuss their proposed reactions to these Turkish developments. Still determined to push the nationalists into signing the Treaty of Sèvres, the Entente mulled over their options. In the face of continued Turkish refusal, the Ankara government disdained the idea of entering negotiations with the Istanbul government, and the use of the Treaty of Sèvres as a basis for negotiations was intolerable. By March, the Second Battle of Annona was launched by the Greeks, who were again bested by the Turkish defenders. Deals had since been made between the nationalists and the Italians, French, and Soviet Union. And when attempted adaptations to the Treaty of Sèvres were offered by the Entente, Greece resisted. The Greeks thus found themselves headed toward the river Sakarya with another army ready for war. The river's location was less than 100 kilometers from the rebellious Turks in Ankara, forcing Mustafa Kemal's men into a direct confrontation. The Battle of Sakarya would last for a grueling 3 weeks in total, until the Greeks were beaten down to the point of another withdrawal as a new fall season rolled around. This would be their last attempt to assault the Ankara government directly, as their attention now shifted to protecting the lands they had already successfully captured, such as Smyrna. With the Entente unwilling to send manpower in their support and the Soviets backing the Turks, Greece was losing its will to fight this war. All the Western nations would do to half-heartedly aid their Greek friends was to propose another modified version of the Treaty of Sèvres, but this still stood in opposition to the values of the Grand National Assembly and was thus declined once more. The ongoing stalemate begged the question, why didn't the Turks set in motion their own offensive? So they did. Agreements had thus far been made with important Western nations, leaving only the Istanbul government and the Greeks for the nationalists to take on. The former was less ambitious when it came to a want for battle. The Greeks, though taking a more defensive stance around Smyrna, had yet to call off the war. Thus, Mustafa Kemal, now commander-in-chief, nurtured his revolutionary forces into an army strong enough to give it one good go against their British-supported neighbor. The men were readying for what would be deemed the Great Offensive. The kickoff would come at the Battle of Dumlupınar on August 26, 1922. It would be a 4-day clash between the fighters of Mustafa Kemal and Georgios Hatzianestis. The Greeks were already tired, demoralized, and fighting under the command of a man Hatzianestis regarded by many as mentally unstable. At the very least, The Turkish attack quickly folded the Greek defense force and pushed the occupiers into a disorganized retreat heading toward Izmir. The nationalists chased their fleeing opponents with new poise and burning excitement. The following weeks would see each of Greece's holdings in Turkey fall like dominoes until everything was Turkish once more. The British, now watching their Greek friends evacuate the lands they so hoped to possess, began to question if military intervention of their own would be necessary. The problem was that back home in Britain, the general public strongly opposed entering another war on foreign soil. Whilst the government under David Lloyd George hoped to put a stop to the GNA fighters once and for all, both sides of the spectrum were met in the middle by Mustafa Kemal himself, as he agreed to enter negotiations at Mudanya. These talks, despite the great hesitation of the Greeks, were to culminate in the Armistice of Mudanya on October 11, 1922. The agreement required the Greeks to finish withdrawing their troops from eastern Thrace and put temporary restrictions on Turkish forces, which by now were the nationalists alone. The Istanbul government and the Ottoman Empire as a whole had disappeared into the wind with the Sultan's abdication at the nudge of the nationalist forces before the war's end. The ultimate end to the Turkish War of Independence and subsequent Greco-Turkish War would come on July 24, 1923, in Lausanne, Switzerland. The Treaty of Lausanne confirmed the new existence of a Turkish state, the successor to the Ottoman Empire. It would take a year past its signed date for the agreement to go into effect. 8 months of negotiations birthed 143 articles and a consensus concerning the Turkish Straits, Turkey's new borders, regional trade, and more. The agreement ensured the birth of the new Republic of Turkey in place of the expired Ottoman Empire. The new Turkish state, though fully independent and self-determining, was set to lose various Ottoman lands. Public debts once owned by the Ottoman Empire were divided between Turkey and the former Ottoman states. As the articles came together, Turkey became ever more a legitimate and sovereign state in the eyes of the world. On October 29, 1923, Mustafa Kemal officially declared the foundation of the Republic of Turkey, and he would serve as its first elected president. In 1934, the new Turkish parliament bestowed upon President Mustafa Kemal the name Atatürk. The great revolutionary and Turkish leader was now deemed the father of the Turks for all he had done to birth the fully independent, sovereign state of Turkey. He had gone from a military man of the Ottoman Empire to a renowned hero willing to go toe-to-toe with the empire he served for the sake of his people and his country, and he succeeded. Atatürk and the brave Turkish people fought a war against anyone and everyone who stood in their way of ultimate freedom, and they won.